For those of you who don't know me, thankfully I know most of y'all in the room. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Cooper. I'm with the Greater Sarasota Chamber of Commerce. Thank you all for being out here tonight, particularly those that continue, a number of faces here for the fourth week of the series. And typically I've been doing an introduction to why we're doing these series, but I don't want to do that for the fourth time for the benefit of those people who have been here all four times. We'll just kind of move ahead. But thanks, Phil. But what I will do for those who have, this is the first week you're here, is just do a brief recap of what we've done in the past. So what in the last 3 weeks, how did we get to this point? What were the points of discussion? And in week one, we really started out with a baseline framework of the definitions. So what are we talking about when we talk about traffic? How has it changed over time? How does the human condition interact with the roadway condition? And what is this thing called traffic? What is automobile congestion? How does it work? And how has it changed over time? In the second week, we brought in a former assistant secretary from the Florida Department of Transportation to talk about transit systems. How are they funded? How are they changing? What's going on around us from a large scale perspective? And then last week we had a gentleman in from Kimley Horn to talk about traffic studies and land use. So how do we do traffic studies? How do we project what's happening? What is things like internal capture? How do you do these things? What are the numbers? What are the standards? Where are the manuals that you look to give a good perspective of that? And then also talk briefly a little bit about parking and how parking relates to transit and transportation and traffic as they all intermix. And this week we're going to be talking a little bit about capital improvements, what's planned and whatnot, particularly from the standpoint of healing the grid. And the grid system in the city of Sarasota is one that's really been long-standing. If you look at the old Nolan plan from, almost 80 years ago now, you see a very similar baseline grid system plan back then that you see today. So it is held, but you'll see some interesting projects on how to heal the grid and what we do with the grid. And I assume he'll talk about, is this loud enough? Okay, good. Am I talking too fast? Yes. So my wife tells me I talk too fast. There was an article not too long ago in the Herald Tribune. They called me an accomplished speed talker. I don't know if that's a compliment or an observation or what it is. I do everything fast. And I stopped drinking caffeine like a year ago. But I think it's important for us to continue this walk through transit and mobility and concepts and what we're doing here. So with that, what I would like to do is introduce a partner of mine in this, putting together this series, really the brainchild behind it, to introduce tonight's speaker. But before I do so, I want to make sure I take a moment just to thank our sponsors that have helped support this event, promote it and bring it out, the least of which being Gulf Coast Community Foundation, who together with their donors transform the region through bold and proactive philanthropy and are very focused on the future of transit and mobility in this area as it affects our population. SRQ Media, who's helped support this from a promotional standpoint. Eric Collins, who's been here week after week videoing this event, and of course the Tableside Restaurant Group, owners of the Francis, who have hosted us. So very appreciative of the support in this and what we've seen it come together, and we've been very appreciative of the turnout for this. So with that, I'll introduce partner at Hoyt Architects and former chair of the Greater Sarasota Chamber of Commerce, Chris Gallagher.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you again. And I'd like to thank a lot of the staff that I've seen here week after week here. Liz Albert, who we've seen many weeks. Commissioner Liz Albert is here. I see Eileen Normau from the Planning Board is here again. So thank you all for joining us many times. Patrick is here from the Planning Board. Patrick Gannon. So tonight we've got as Kevin said, we've been through several different topics. This one I think you'll find very enjoyable. Andrew, many of you know Andrew. He actually worked for the city of Sarasota for some time with Karen Murphy, crafting our form-based code. But Andrew's got a much longer history. He's got a bachelor and a master's degree from the University of Miami. He taught at the University of Miami School of Architecture. And he spent many years with Dover Cole, who is one of the preeminent town planning firms in the United States. They're down in the Miami area as well. And again, spent many of his years there working with them, and now has his own planning firm. He's also I think you'll see some of his artwork in here. He's a very accomplished artist as well, does beautiful renderings of many of the, in fact, I've worked with him on some projects and just does a beautiful job with rendering those. So again, some ideas about capital improvements, about transportation mobility planning for the future, and ideas that we can implement both in the city and county of Sarasota. Andrew?
Thank you, Chris and Kevin, for that introduction, and for all of you for coming tonight. So we'll be talking about healing the grid and a few other topics this evening. And I wanted to start off with this slide, 10 characteristics of walkability, and you're probably wondering what those grades are. Those grades are what I would give Sarasota on these different counts. And where you see 2 grades, I think that the city has 1 grade for the downtown and the walk-to-town neighborhoods, and another grade elsewhere in the more suburban part of the city. So I know you're not supposed to ever read slides to your audience because they'll immediately fall asleep. But so these are the 10 which are the 10 aspects, characteristics of walkability in a street. Now, I feel as a Sarasota resident now, I can say this as that we're not doing too well in a lot of them. However, we do score high in several of them. And so our streets are in a pretty good state in the best parts of the city. And then elsewhere, we are not pedestrian friendly. And so we are a driving city. We are a city that is autocentric. And that needs to change. So we talked about the grid, and what is the power that American grids and networks of streets offer, and what is the solution for traffic? Human beings, as they move about between origin and destination, have a choice to get from, the route. How do we get from one place to another? And when you have a street with an intersection, you have a route. And then as you start to add in and build in options like this, you notice that the amount of routes or permutations through the grid start to multiply exponentially, more so the number of streets that you're adding. So let's go from a 4x4 grid to an 8. Now notice what's happening to this number. Sorry about the color. 35 routes. 126, 12,870, and so forth and so on. So when we have continuous grids, that is interconnected streets, without cul-de-sacs and without blockages and interruptions, we suddenly have thousands and thousands of routes for automobiles, pedestrians, and cyclists. So what does that mean? That means that where congestion occurs, there's always a safety valve for one to get around that congestion. And so there is an equation, which I'm not going to bother you with. It's a long equation that actually quantifies how you calculate the number of routes in a grid. And it's truly amazing. When you get to a 10 by 10 grid, we're talking about 100,000 routes. And this is the secret of why cities around the world are able to have very high densities and still not have crushing traffic. So grids plus multimodalism. So this is Beaufort, South Carolina, and the same network is present in Savannah and Charleston and Brooklyn and Key West, cities large and small around the country. And many of these small and mid-sized towns have a density larger than Sarasota, but without the type of congestion that we see at our most troubled intersections. So that's a very interesting thing that we need to think about. So we have a legacy of the Nolan grid, as Kevin said, but we have a grid which is crippled in places. And so tonight we're going to look at a few places what we mean by a crippled grid. Now this is an intersection. I wanted to go to a farther, not downtown example so that we can think about the metropolitan context. This is Beneva right here, and then this is Fruitville. This is Beneva Commons, and I forget what the other one is called, but there's a Publix, there's a Bells over there, and several other shops surrounded by residential of different densities. This is multifamily over here. This is single-family detached houses. There is a multi-story apartment building over there, and also townhouses. So a pretty good mix. Now, the resident of this apartment lives just about 100 feet from the door to that Commerce. This is Publix right here, which is something that fulfills the daily needs for a lot of residents. So this is as the crow flies, and this is how you have to drive there because there is no connection, there is no grid there. Here's another apartment. Now this one is even more spectacular. This is as the crow flies. Okay? So, what do you think is happening when we don't have a grid? We're producing more tailpipe emissions, more CO2, more sedentary behavior, more particles are spilling out of our tailpipes. So the grid, or the lack of it, is really telling us what our destiny is as a city. Now, this house right here, if the resident wanted to go to Publix, it would be an easy 200-foot stroll if there were a grid. So this is where this resident has to go. Drive, of course, to Fruitville, battle this intersection, wait there, queue maybe twice in that light, and then come up Beneva, which is oversized 5 lanes, because there's no grid, and then turn into Publix, only to park perhaps farther than the house was from the store. Look at this house to go to that's McDonald's and that's a bank right there. This is the route. So 5 times the distance. This is a shocking one too. So on and so forth. So what happens is that because we have no grid, and this is true at every intersection in Sarasota, your Bee Ridges and Siesta Drive, your Benevas and Fruitvilles, every suburban intersection in Sarasota, without exception, has a crippled grid around it. And therefore, we have a low-density environment which is producing much more traffic than it should. And we have oversized streets that have to be designed for every single trip to occur by car. Our vehicle miles traveled, our VMT, is perhaps 100 times what it should be because we have not created the network. So this is a redraw of that grid at Beneva and Fruitville, showing that if you were to be able to stitch the grid around those properties together, you could then begin to make this a little bit more human. You could have protected bike lanes. You could perhaps give a lane over to transit. You could have crosswalks that were of a decent size. You could start to tame those roadways and tame those intersections, which you will never be able to do if we don't start building back our grid. So now let's look at downtown in the central Sarasota districts. This next sequence, Debbie Amari in the audience, we did together as part of a research project. So Debbie is slicking in her chair. So this right here is a slice through Sarasota showing in black what our street network looks like. And so forgive me if I'm blocking any of you. So Siesta Drive, Weber, Hillview, Bahia Vista, Bay, Fruitville, 10th, 12th, 17th, MLK, Myrtle. And the north and south ones, 301 Washington Boulevard, 41 Tamiami Trail, John Ringling Boulevard over to St. Armand's Circle. So sorry about the color. Here in magenta are the opportunities for grid restoration. So it may not seem like a lot, but do you see all the missing segments in our grid? Okay. Not coincidentally, where those missing segments occur are where some of our worst traffic occurs, because cars simply have no way to do what they're supposed to do, which is drivers are intelligent enough to use the infinite number of routes that are present in a grid where it exists in order to get from point A to point B. But where it doesn't exist, that behavior is not possible. So whereas our grid is better than many cities who don't have one at all, we have a grid problem. Now, this is one opportunity for a regional grid, which is once we have made a decision to allow density on a barrier island, such as Longboat Key, then it's absolute folly to imagine that all of that traffic should be funneled into one crossing point. So probably if we had planned, 100 years ago correctly, we wouldn't have designated that barrier island to receive all of that density. But now that we've done it, we have to think about ways for additional cross-bay connectivity. So, this is a zoom in. Now, this is the intersection which has gotten a lot of press. The view, right here. Here's the quay. There's the bayfront. And notice here the old tracks, which go through the city right here and where a lot of streets stop. So here are opportunities to restore that grid. So the Mound Street, starting in the south, the Mound Street Tamiami Trail confluence right here, where the new lift station is being built. Notice that trafficked intersection also has several spots where the grid is crippled right here. So if you notice here that if you were to add, for instance, Payne Park and a few other streets which have been barricaded off, you would be able to perhaps add 100 different routes around that intersection. Notice here that at the Pines of Sarasota, right here, 17th Street and 12th Street, which are major east-west streets, right? So as drivers or cyclists are coming either westbound or eastbound on 12th and 17th, guess what? You cannot access one side of the city or the other. So you're forced to go down to the Fruitville Rosemary District area right here. So these consequently heat up. And then finally, the Cross Bay connection right here, which is, I think, in the long term, will be crucial in addressing the Gulf Stream and 41 intersection. So, as part of that, when we look at new bridges, our bridges cannot be the old DOT, Department of Transportation formula. They have to be multimodal. They have to do a better job in addressing all the users. So, many of you, I put this boat here in the rendering because what's true for cars is also true for boats. You know, the yacht club, the boats have to go all the way around Bird Key in order to get out to the bridge because the Coon Key Bridge is quite low. So that's also adding a lot of pollution too because there's no direct way to get out to Sarasota Bay. So in the future, if we were to raise that and actually have a serious bike lane, a protected bike lane, properly sized sidewalks, and the car lanes, we could also then help the boat traffic not have to make that 1 mile unnecessary turn around Bird Key to get out to the bay. Here's a comparison of the two sections. So this would be a before and after of what that bridge would look like. And this is just a visualization to show what it could be. And that's the type of thing that you could actually start to look at for any new bridge, to make every bridge an opportunity for civic art rather than deploying those old Department of Transportation formulas. This is showing how you could take the causeway over on John Ringling and start to reshape it. Now that the hurricane did us the favor of showing that Australian pines don't belong in Florida, actually, and so we see that evidenced by the big root balls which are standing up. We could start to then recreate, using a native palette of trees, the maritime hammock that would have been here in Sarasota. And then we can start to recreate protected bike lanes, on-street parking, and also do away with the power lines over time. And so this is these are a few now slides showing those 10 aspects of walkability, mixture of uses. So mixture of uses, this is from Sarasota and this one is from Rome. So you see here the lights are on at night because the building is vertically stratified. And this is important not only to animate the city, but also to make you feel safe. Because when you're walking in a street and you see that the lights are on in the apartments above, we know that help is never far away. And that's one of the secrets of how cities feel safe at night when there is a high enough density and a mixture of uses. Shallow setback in the urban core, or zero setback in the urban core, and shallower setback later, farther away. So buildings really need to come right up to the edge of the sidewalk in order to shape that space and not be set back behind parking lots or yards. So this is a comparison from Orange Avenue. Forgive me, I'm getting a blank. What is the name of your project? Citrus Square. Citrus Square. This is from the downtown along Pineapple. So which would you feel safer walking along? So it's important that we not do this type of thing anymore. So no blank walls. And this is not at all accusing all the people in this room are on the right side, but this is just an example that we need to continue that fight. And in the code that we currently have, the primary streets, they actually demand a certain level of transparency on ground floors, and secondary streets don't. So when you hear, why is it important to increase the number of primary streets over time as we do a code rewrite or modify the code, that's one of the main reasons why, is because the secondary street standards allow for blankness in some cases. And so that's one of the things where coding meets reality. So on-street parking adds friction right here and also protects the pedestrian. Now, would they be eating here if this were a fast travel lane? You couldn't actually have that sidewalk cafe. You couldn't feel safe along that sidewalk without that barrier of parked steel that cars provide. So car parking is not just for driver convenience, but it's also that layer of protection for the pedestrian. Narrower and fewer lanes with crossable intersections. So there's nothing more daunting than having to cross as a pedestrian a large multi-lane highway in the middle of the city. And this is one thing that Sarasota doesn't have this problem at all, which other cities fell into the trap of making one-way multi-lane avenues. And so in many assignments that we tackle in different states and around the world, we're trying to bring back the two-way condition, and so we change 6 lanes going in one direction back into two-way. When you have all the lanes going in the same direction, you tend to speed, and it tends to be very intimidating to the pedestrian. Street trees. So street trees need to be not here in the yard. It's good if they're in the yard too, but they need to be between the pedestrian and the parked cars or the moving cars. So this is a detail which unfortunately is lacking in a lot of communities around the country. There's a good attention in creating landscaping and trees here, but not here. It has to be here to have value to the pedestrian, between the cars and the sidewalk, what we call the tree zone or the tree yard. There's different names depending on where you are. And of course sidewalks. And lower traffic volumes, which we'll get into in a second, because that requires multimodalism. So forgive me for those of you who may have seen this sequence before. I have to, in the name of tough love, say that the street cross-section that we're getting for Tamiami Trail is not up to Sarasota standards. And I wish it could have been different. But this is the DOT section right here, which is frictionless and has some lip service to cyclists in that it has a conventional bike lane, and yet it is it has a lot of the other things that you would expect from the Department of Transportation. So we need a better cross-section for Tamiami Trail. So the one that gets built, if it's too late to stop it, consider it a placeholder for the next generation to then fix, because we'll have to. I showed this because I think that we're getting sometimes force-fed the wrong cross-sections, because we have state roads that cross our city, and sometimes we say, well, let the state take care of it, let the state maintain it, and therefore we also don't get to choose the cross-section. So they do the cross-section, and then it determines the design. Whereas city-owned streets, we have more control over. This is the a close-in of that. So that bike lane, for instance, that's a conventional bike lane. How many of you feel safe biking in a conventional bike lane with 45 to 60 miles per hour traffic next to you? So I see one hand. So there are a few intrepid, courageous people. Most people we found in cities around the world on higher speed roadways, higher volume roadways, require physical separation. It's called a protected bike lane. So this is what the Dutch have figured out, and the Germans and the Danish, and they have exported a whole series of cycling strategies around the world, which is starting to gain major traction here in North America. They include protected intersections and protected bike lanes. And the moment that cities do this, the number of cyclists explodes. And it's not only the ones wearing spandex, which are great. However, it's also the casual commuters, it's the children, it's the more vulnerable riders, it's all of the other, what we call interested but concerned cyclists, the ones who would cycle if they weren't afraid of getting smushed. And so this is the two roundabouts at 10th and 14th. I often get asked by different friends, are you for or against roundabouts? Oops, excuse me. So it's not that simple. When we talk about roundabouts, okay. Roundabouts, going back to the grid, roundabouts rely upon the presence of a permeable and pervious grid around them, a grid of streets. So currently, at 10th and 14th and much of the North Trail, we have the ability to turn left into any of the side streets, okay? But notice here that we have now a sealed median that's going between the two roundabouts, okay? So what will that do to the roundabouts? Now, if all of the left-hand turn movements along the corridor are forced to go to the roundabout in order to return and then make a right turn. What's painful is that other cities had hired our team to correct this type of thing when their roundabouts were choking and they had just installed medians in the name of safety and traffic flow, and then these were starting to choke. And so this is an example of the type of thing where we are creating our own problems, and we know what they are. So sorry, okay. So I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more depth later on. But another thing is the legacy trail extension. So I don't like to do this. This is kind of manipulative, but you're going to forgive me. Rails to trails is a good thing. But I want everybody in the audience to say, rails with trails. Thank you. Rails with trails. There is a movement all across the country to say, look at that old abandoned right-of-way. It's 19th century technology. That's never coming back. Let's pave it over and make cyclists happy, okay? That's rails to trails. We need rails with trails. This is a right-of-way which is large enough to accommodate all of those users, and we should not foreclose upon the opportunity to revive that important mode of traffic, which is going to become even more important as we see where fossil fuels are going. Since we are in the era, even though we don't know it because we're back down under $3 a gallon, we don't realize it, but we are in the sunset of the fossil fuel era. And so we will regret sorely that we have torpedoed really important infrastructure from a previous generation. This is Tamiami Trail. This is just a what if of the future. What could we do about taming that boulevard in the future when cars have a slightly diminished role in our lives? So this is what 120 feet of right-of-way could be reconfigured it as over time. So this is an inventory of the planned and under construction projects regarding Florida Rail right now. So we have all aboard Florida, the Bright Line, which is higher speed. It's not true high speed, but it's close. That will connect the East Coast. Here we have in white Amtrak, which goes up through the center of the state. And then we have future possible extensions in other colors. Now this right here is a rail corridor which already exists. So as many of you know, the biggest barrier to rail is right-of-way acquisition. But we have a completely intact right-of-way that connects Sarasota to Bradenton at its downtown and then ends up at historic Union Station in downtown Tampa. It's in the ground. So this is a picture from Guatemala. It may be Tikal. Okay, so those intrepid explorers had taken their machetes and walked through the jungle, and they had come upon this right here, which was the vestige was overgrown. And not until it was cleaned up did we realize what had existed before, right? So in many respects, we are like the Maya. So let me ask you to take a leap here when we talk about infrastructure that has been buried and forgotten. If there were no airport in Sarasota, let's say Tampa, let's say in entire Southwest Florida, yet somebody was aware of an air traffic control tower and pristine runways that had just been taken over by vines, and it was within the city limits, would you not agree that it would at least be worth studying if we could remove the vines and the strangler figs and see if we could create an airport if it were already there and we knew that we may need it in the future? Okay? This is the case with what we have with our rail. We have a rail corridor which goes right through the heart of our city and connects us. It's the holy grail of rail. Connects us to other cities, and yet we haven't really even given it serious study and discussion. It's a major part of our mobility strategy, or it should be. So I ask you, let's not be like the Maya, and let's really value and treasure our previous generation's investment and not think ourselves that we're beyond the rail era, now we're in the car era, because I think reality is going to punish us in the future. So this is the route in greater detail where it follows, and how it ends up in downtown Tampa, and with connecting to Tampa's plan, we can actually get to the airport if you do this. And another thing which a lot are not aware of is that this port right here, which is the Port Manatee in Parrish. This is one of the only ports in the state of Florida which is ready to receive post-Panamax ships. So these are the ships that, now that the Panama Canal has been dredged and widened, there are very few ports that are able to receive the new size ships. So ports all around the country are scrambling to be able to dredge their own channels to receive the ships. And so why is this important? Well, when all of the goods come from Asia and from the great manufacturing centers, they no longer will, they will go right to the ports that are ready to receive those ships. And so this right here will be an economic engine for the whole region. And it's already there on our rail line. Food for thought. So here, yes, that does say Sarasota. We had several stations in our city. One at the end of Main Street, one on Lemon, and a few others. The rail service was astonishingly good in Sarasota, and from the 1920s all the way to the mid-60s, we had service. That's a picture of the old station that was at the end of Main Street, and Main Street is exceptionally long for a small Florida town, and the reason is that the rail station was at the end of it. So that's why what we call Upper Main was not so forlorn in the past, because it was animated by that important anchor of the passenger rail station, and that's how this Main Street could be this long. This is a picture from Charlotte showing how transit-oriented development, or how they've started to boost ridership by increasing density and mixed use at rail stops. So it's always folly to make a rail investment without doing a land use investment right here. So the ridership helps pay for the rail, and the rail helps support the ridership. This is a plan that I had worked on when a city employee showing as an exercise, what would it be necessary as far as a multimodal and premium transit plan in order to make cars more of a choice rather than an absolute necessity. And so this is a first hypothesis at the extent of the transit system that one would need and where the stations would be in order to make that possible. So this could be, water taxis, this could be BRT, and it could be electric trams once again. Now, these are probably going to be too dry, so I don't want to linger too long on them. But I think that we need to also refine our thinking of how we use the impact fees to fund transit. And also, if we are serious about going towards a form-based code, we should make our impact fees more form-based and less use-based. So that could be a topic of another conversation. A premium transit network. Once again, I'll leave this for you to read later. There are a lot of compelling reasons that we need to invest in premium transit. And then if we're going to tackle a mobility plan, we need to get these exhibits in there so that we can answer the question of why, what, and how it will be paid for. These are the finance strategies which should be explored as well. Now, it's probably dangerous to leave the show with some controversy, but I wanted to encourage all of you in attendance to be very critical when you hear about certain topics which you may have heard about lately. Pedestrian overpasses. When we talk about connectivity, there is an instinct to think that it means a hamster tube across Tamiami Trail 41. That human beings will never cross this roadway and that we have to get them up, safe, out from the cars, and then down across. So there is a huge body of evidence why this is not a good solution. And so it seems like it. A lot of things in planning are counterintuitive. They seem like they must be right, but they're actually not. So in the question and answer, if you want to hear more about that, would be glad to. Road widening. When we add asphalt to earth, let it only be to heal the grid and never to widen a street. So I ask you all to not consider, please, another turn lane, another lane addition, another anything, unless it is to heal the grid. Because it has been proven that not only does it not help traffic, it worsens it. And this is not at all as a lack of gratitude for those who have worked hard on that front, because it's not your fault. We're trained to believe that road widening, if we just widen it a little bit more, we're going to solve this thing. So, speed bumps and chicanes. You know, we're speeding, so we've got to put some sort of obstacle there. Long-term traps. Now, you're going to laugh at this because you know I was involved in the State Street Garage, and I am a fan of those in the room who have worked on it. So once again, this is not at all to cast in a bad light a project that I worked on. But when we put our wealth toward the storage of automobiles in the way that we're doing, not only will it impoverish us, but it will get us deeper and deeper and deeper into car dependency, which may seem like a good idea right now, but will not when our finances are different or when we really begin to see how far we are into fossil fuel depletion. So I beseech you, let's say that as a metropolitan area, we're not going to invest in any more car storage. Now this is more of a county and state way, but state sort of thing, but it also deals with the city. When we spend $100 million on a diverging diamond, this is $100 million that you're not going to get to spend on things that really make a difference. It looks really cool though, the diverging diamond. You know, you're on the other side where you're not supposed to be. It sort of feels like Britain, but not really, without the castles. But when we do a diverging diamond, and then we also open up our hinterland to development, we are guaranteeing that this will not be a solution for traffic. So, no more diverging diamonds, no more new interchanges. And this is this final one right here. I'm all for Elon Musk, and I'm all for all of the Google and all of the innovators. But this is a dangerous trap. This is a distraction. We say, but there's Uber, but there's autonomous vehicles. We'll be able to follow at 1 inch, you know, the next car, and it'll all be fine. Autonomous vehicles are a distraction. So we have to stop thinking that we're going to be able to swap out something and be able to drive on happily ever after. We have to activate the other modes. So a next-gen mobility plan. These are just, I promise I'll be merciful and only show you 2 or 3 more images. This is City of El Paso, and this is their new electric tram, which is one of 6 or 7 lines, the first one to get built. And this will connect the downtown to the colleges and the entertainment district in a corridor that's quite similar in scale to our North Trail. And El Paso was able to divert state funds. El Paso, Texas where they're not into electric trams. They're into meat and potatoes, big asphalt, wide open skies. They were able to get them to divert $100 million and not build a downtown interchange and instead build an electric tram system. And the miraculous thing is that we drew it, others drew it, and they're building it. They found their old streetcars in storage from the 1920s and 30s. They're refurbishing it with Wi-Fi and air conditioning. And they're going to have electric trolleys again running up and down, connecting the most important and dense parts of the town. So think of Sarasota and what this means about Sarasota. We really need to start thinking about something other than asphalt. This is a protected bike lane. I purposely didn't show you a really attractive one because I want to show you one that's cheap. So in DC, they said, you know what, it's not good enough to have the bike lane just on the edge of the street next to high-speed traffic. People are getting smushed. That's the scientific description. So what we're going to do is protected bike lanes in the Dutch manner. And so they changed the parking so that instead of having the bike lane here and the parking along the curb, they did what the Dutch and the Danish and all the rest are doing, which is have the parking protect the bike lane. And they did it just with paint and a few plastic sticks. In the next few years, it'll be upgraded with planters and other things like that. So this is the guerrilla tactical urbanist right here, stage. Sorry about that repeat. This is Jeddah in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This is showing the charrette drawing for their electric elevated system. And then that's the build-out map that they're currently pursuing based upon those recommendations. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, do we have any questions for Andrew? Yes, sir, in the back row. Andrew, would you come, I think our camera angle is about right here. So and would you repeat whatever the question
Yes,
is?
thank you.
Pedestrian crossings, I
Yes.
noticed there were no vertical signs or pedestrian warnings, what I call the big yellow signs. Everything seemed to be on the street. Okay, the markings. What is your approach to what I call eliminating sign pollution?
So this question is from Lou Acosta regarding signs and their usefulness as markers and indicators to the pedestrian, what to do, and to the driver. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but Sarasota has way too many signs, and signs are increasingly ineffective in their ability to get us to modify our behavior. So this has been evidenced by a lot of great experimental work, being not experimental anymore, it's pretty old already, done by many urbanists in which they reduce signs, all of them that are supposedly for safety, and see if the environment becomes more unsafe. So you take out all those pedestrian warnings, you sometimes even take out the stop signs, you take out the park here, no parking there, back in here, you can't back in there. You take out everything and you see, does the world come to an end? And it doesn't. In fact, the real estate just looks much more valuable and attractive. So we really need to start thinking about how we deploy infrastructure such as signs and see whether we're getting what was promised, or if we're just getting a lot of visual pollution and distraction. So. Yes, I'll get you in a moment.
On Main Street, the east end of Main Street, down near 301, you have that angled parking. It looks like it reduces the depth of the sidewalk What do you think about the city being able to change that either to no parking or parallel parking?
On American main streets, there's really 2 or 3 ways that you typically see it. One is angled, and one is parallel, and then one is reverse angle parking. So it's a classic way to accommodate on-street parking. I would say that some cities have graduated to parallel parking, those who have had angled, once they realized that there was enough pedestrian traffic, or there could be pedestrian traffic, by giving a more generous dimension to the sidewalk. So for instance, downtown Coral Gables near Miami is in the process of changing the angled to parallel, because they realized that there was such an appetite for walking in sidewalk cafes that it wasn't going to adversely affect the merchants by losing the spaces to get that extra sidewalk dimension. So I think that in a place that is just starting out on its revitalization trajectory, like maybe Sarasota a few years ago, it was all right to have the appearance of abundant parking as far as what angled parking provided, but it may be a reasonable approach right now to reduce parking by reconfiguring it as parallel in the future. So I think that they're both valid. I don't want to be, evasive, but I think they're both valid solutions, but it's a matter of maturing. Yes?
Yeah, so you showed us some beautiful illustrations and mock-ups of things that cost incredible amounts of money,
Yes.
dedicated right-of-way transit, BRT and rail, and I appreciate the clarity of vision of saying we could have these things, and look, a diverging diamond costs $100 million, and that's $100 million we're not putting toward these other things. At the same time, there is a chicken and the egg problem in terms of getting from vision A to vision B of what Sarasota is, and in the short run, a car-dependent transportation network induces car-dependent land use, which induces car-dependent transportation, et cetera. So I guess kind of in light of that problem, I want to know sort of what do you see as the first steps? Like in the next 5 years, what would you like to see the city and county of Sarasota do to move toward a different vision?
Okay. Thank you for the question. The question is, looks expensive. What would be the baby steps to start us on this path toward premium transit if we can't yet afford the big ticket items? So when you mentioned the county, that's a very good point. So our county runs SCAT, and so the county is the owner and the operator of a transit system. Some municipalities take on the responsibility when they see that their county is not doing the job that they would like. So El Paso, for instance, has stepped up and taken a bigger role than the county. And that's common for cities who are dissatisfied with their county's transit system. Now, SCAT operates corridor bus routes, Bee Ridge and 41 and all sorts of other corridors. So something that wouldn't cost anything at all would say, we are going to designate the outermost lane for taxis, buses, ambulances. It would just be perhaps paint and maybe a public service announcement, some education. And then if you prune the routes so that they don't have a lot of this squiggly wigglies off into the neighborhoods, and you be sort of cold-hearted and you say, I'm just going to stick to the corridor and I'm going to increase the headway. Headway is the time between vehicles, to no more than 7 minutes, so that if I use that bus, I'm not going to be stranded, and maybe install a counter. So see, I haven't even talked about electric rail. It's just the knowledge that I can walk out of my house and know that there will be a bus there within 5 minutes. Reducing the headways, the certainty for the rider, is one of the most important things that you can do to getting to explode your ridership, to grow it. And that's something that we can do without laying any new track in the ground. It's relatively cheap. So it would get us almost to the state of being able to call ourselves BRT, bus rapid transit, without even having a true BRT system. So you evolve and you keep pushing it forward and forward until you have the mature end condition of a real transit network. I hope that addresses that a bit. Yes, Kevin.
You briefly talked about pedestrian access east-west on US 41 in the city and not doing pedestrian overpasses. What are some suggestions you would make in the future when we really need to connect more
Yes. Okay. So, with all humility, these are not things that I or any of my friends have invented. It's merely a matter of studying what other cities do to tackle that challenge. And other cities are able to get people willing to cross big, bad streets. Okay, so if you've been to the Champs-Élysées, for instance, 10 lanes of craziness, right? And you cross it. If you've been to Pennsylvania Avenue in DC, 8 lanes of craziness, and you cross it. And other smaller but bigger, smaller than those examples, but bigger than our examples, and we cross it happily. Why is that? Well, those places have compelling urbanism in the vicinity. So the presence of satisfying architecture in buildings at the intersection so that you feel dignified in doing so. The other thing is that the crossing time is enough to get across. A very simple little thing. In Pennsylvania Avenue, in DC, most of the big streets have 45 to 60 seconds, and there's a countdown so that you're never worried that you're going to be stranded. You know how much time you have left. But they have about 3 to 5 times amount allocated to the pedestrian to cross the street than we do. Because we're so worried about the cars being inconvenienced that we haven't given enough time for the pedestrian to get across. So increasing the crossing times. The crosswalks, our crosswalks are stingy. In great cities, we don't have 8, 10-foot crosswalks. We have 40-foot. In Barcelona, they have 50-foot crosswalks. So when you cross the Avinguda Diagonal, you feel like a proud being. You're crossing something that looks dimensioned, that you are the king of that whole space. Not that you are some second or third class citizen. That, where people will roll down the window if they see you walking and say, "Are you okay?" It's a proud environment that's detailed to the pedestrian, and people will walk and they will cross the street, even big ones, when we detail it correctly.
Do you think it's still any value to move the US 41 designation further east like was discussed by Andres Kwame during the formulation of his master plan? It was discussed among leaders and at DOT, and they were willing to consider it, at the local would, but it would move 41 over to 301 somewhere.
It's definitely worth study and worth community discussion, yes. And also, as has been shown the case with many state-run roadways, we may, along with rerouting it, have the discussion about de-designation from the state network for at least that segment. So that goes hand in hand. So when we don't like the cross-section that the state force feeds us with, like the poor duck getting his liver fattened, we sometimes as a city should say, we are going to take over that roadway. We are going to control the cross-section. We are not going to let the promise of the state dollars to maintain that roadway in perpetuity be enough of a reason that we will relinquish control over its cross-section. So I think that the rerouting of 41 plus the de-designation of that segment are important conversations to have if we're ever going to do the cross-section that we need. So there's good precedent for cities taking portions of state roadways back from the state and taking it back under their control. So remember, when we saw the sidewalks, for instance, in front of the View, which were greatly increased from the previous one, they were really improved, but maybe they still weren't enough for the scale of the development. We need to focus our angst toward the owner of that roadway, which is the Florida Department of Transportation. It's not our heroic city planners who have done everything they can in staff to increase sidewalk size. It's not a city street, it's a state street. And when we're dissatisfied with the dimensions of the sidewalk or of the tree planting zone or of the asphalt or anything else, we have to realize that the state owns that roadway. So if you look at where the other cities, all the other city streets that are not in the state's jurisdiction that are owned by the city, in every case the sidewalks have been widened with additional street trees and all of the good things that you would see in a pedestrian-friendly environment. So remember, state road. That goes to the heart of why we find that roadway dissatisfying as a place, as an address. Yes, Francine?
So
It is almost pedestrian friendly. Rosemary District has a relatively intact grid, except for the places that I showed you where it's lacking. It's moth-eaten, so it has a lot of gaps in the urban fabric. There's a lot of empty lots, and it's not usable green space, Mary. It's just empty lots. So empty lots, if they're not true parks, tend to be damaging to the pedestrian experience. You know, when you're walking in an urban district, especially at night, you crave that transparency and those lights on. But when you have chain link and no building, you tend not to want to walk there. So Rosemary is maturing, and there's a lot of great infill projects that are now starting to heal that fabric, because with healing the grid, you have to also heal the fabric, and you have to build back that street wall of continuous buildings and parks in order to make the district pedestrian viable. So it's almost there. It has all of the ingredients necessary to be eminently walkable. Debbie?
On the street hierarchy diagram, and when it was last updated, and what needs to happen to it in order, as part of the form, in order to heal the.
So Debbie asked about the street hierarchy diagram. I think you're referring to primary versus secondary streets. So the current form-based code, which only governs the downtown and some of the walk-to-town neighborhoods, such as the Rosemary District and the area around Burns Court, Pineapple Square, parts of Gillespie Park and such. The higher standard of pedestrian friendliness and architecture applies to primary streets. So a special select set of streets have been designated primary streets. And in the normal course of form-based code maintenance that you expect is that every year or every few years, as the city is starting to mature and fill up, you're supposed to revisit that grid, that network, that diagram, and add primary streets to your code so that new development will come up to that quality. Because if you don't maintain that diagram in your code, you may get suburban autocentric development in your precious downtown core along secondary streets. So there are certain places in the city like Fruitville, certain frontages that could use that upgrade to primary street status, but that maintenance may not have occurred. So Duane Platter-Zyberg, who did that initial code, when they did the primary streets, which is where the higher standard applies, they did it in a different Sarasota. It was a Sarasota that was boarded up downtown. It was a place where you couldn't imagine that it would achieve maybe the vibrancy that it has achieved. So it was very timid in that it didn't require a lot of the frontages to be primary status. But I think now we can take the next step and upgrade it. Sure.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Andrew. The cross bay connection to Long Grove Peak. It was in the works years ago, and matter of fact, I think in the mid-'80s they talked about another
Yes.
bridge landing in the middle of the peak. It would not be easy because it would take some acquisition of some right of way. Is there any discussion about that? You mentioned it.
Well, I have no inside knowledge. It was just an observation, hearing about the efforts of the previous efforts, that I just wanted to acknowledge it on the map. Not my idea, but I think that that it's something that needs to be revisited, and also not just the bridge, but also the water-based transport. So, you know, you look at old photos from 100 years ago, and there was the SS Mistletoe, and the Mistletoe was bringing passengers back and forth up Sarasota Bay from Longboat, you know, to Sarasota. I mean, it was a steamer, and it was, I mean, but we had an advanced transit network, water-based and rail and all sorts of other things that we just let get dismantled. And we're talking about 1915. So that connectivity is not. Yeah, the connectivity is not only by the bridge, it's by all the other modes that we need to activate. So, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. we are concluding week 4 here, going into week 5, and I want to tell you, we've had some, for those of you who've been to many of these, we've got some very accomplished presenters we've brought in. They fought over week 5. Week 5 is what's the future look like, and what are the new and interesting, and notwithstanding Andrew's comments about the future of auto-driven cars and things, Rick Hall, who is our speaker next week, is going to be talking quite a bit about the future and what that holds for us. So I hope you'll join us. Rick speaks and works around the country, around the world, and he is also quite familiar with Sarasota. He's done some work here too and was involved with Dwani in those early plans. So he will bring both local knowledge and wisdom from around the world. So I hope you'll join us again next week for week number 5. And one last word of thanks for our sponsors again: Gulf Coast Community Foundation, SRQ Media, Tableside, and Eric for our videos. I hope you are getting, for those of you that have been on the list, all of the videos for all of these speakers are available. Their PowerPoints are available. So all of this is on the record for everybody, and those slides that Andrew went by very quickly, again, you can go back to them and see what's on that. So thank you again. Good night.